amazing gallery. What you created, what you brought together just has me astounded. Thank you. My paintings are about honoring farmers. And my perspective is that of the farm wife. I am not a farm wife, but my mother was. And I lost my mother a month ago, and these paintings were done to honor her while I still had her. My mother's memory began to fade. It happens to most of us. And the stories she shared were so valuable to me, and it wasn't a time of quick photographs. It was a time of just living the experience. So these are my little selfies of my mother's life. I found that while I was creating this series, it became something I could share with her, but it also became something bigger. It became the story of how agriculture has changed in the last 100 years. She was born in 1931, just at the time the Depression was hitting, at a time when horses were still being used, but there were tractors, at a time when the milkman still came with his horses, but then by the time she left home, there was the milk truck. Her father was like we were discussing earlier, a very community-minded person, and farm communities depended on these people who had so much respect and ethic of hard work, and I just had to honor that. I'm accustomed to working with the PowerPoint, so I'm going to depend on my notes. And if I had my PowerPoint, I would show you a lovely picture of my mother, but you can come and ask me to see that later if you want. I put this series of paintings together to honor my mother, to honor her memories, but I also had other motivations. One was to recognize that there are so many universal experiences that we have. Those experiences of leaving home for the first time, of falling in love, all these things that we all have. These are the ways that it happened for my mother. One of her experiences that touched me, that my family loves to bring up, is that for her wedding, most of us would get some beautiful dishes or something from our parents. Well, she got 400 baby chickens. Another reason I put together these paintings was this series came together during COVID, which, with all its trials, did have its blessings. As Roberta and I have agreed, we got to focus on our painting. We got to stay home and work. So that was an influence. And it also was an influence in that my family started having weekly Zoom calls. This actually brought my family closer together. I have 13 siblings. And for us all to get together would happen maybe every other year. But suddenly it was happening every Sunday night. The stories I heard, that's where we started, the stories. Do you remember when Dad did this, when Mom did that? So I had more information for my paintings, more context. And then the last reason this series came together is my dear friend Roberta, who's a dynamo, and she said, this is important. Do this. I started doing it for my mother. She said, other people need to see this. So over time, my perspectives have changed as I've grown older, and I began to see my mother as a person, not as just the mom, not as this separate entity taking control of me, but as someone who could be a friend and a person. So I tried to respect that in these paintings. It is my nature to be a bit away from people, a bit isolated, a bit introspective. And one of the tendencies I find is when I go to places, these special places, and I bet you've had these experiences too, you stop and you almost can feel what was happening there 100 years ago, or imagine what was happening there 1,000 years ago. You stand in a beautiful landscape and you can almost imagine the covered wagons going by, or the time before there was populations. And I have that feeling. In my own house, I can sit on the front porch and imagine 100 years ago, the people who sat there before me. So I like having that perspective, and I like trying to bring that into my paintings. And I do that sometimes by messing around with the perspective, by maybe putting two suns in a painting, or an element that's upside down, or some other small story that's happening in the corner. Because to me, all these things can overlap. Time isn't necessarily this one moment. We're all connected to that past and to the future. I read that space is a terrific way of helping us remember those past events. For instance, if you were to create a map right now of your bedroom from when you were 10 years old, if you imagine just drawing that simple map where the window was and the dresser and the bed, and now you begin to walk through, in your mind's eye, you're going to see what was on the wall, what color the curtain was, maybe what shoes are sitting on the floor. When we create that little map, suddenly we can bring in the details. And that's what my work would be when I would listen to my mother's stories, her playing baseball with her big brother, and where the mulberry tree was, and how high the creek was. All these stories, all these wonderful memories of her farm background. I have to point out on this painting, her father had told her to go out and finish picking a row of corn with the horse. And my mother said, I didn't know how to control the horse, but my father said he knew the way. So this was my way of showing her childish perspective, this little upside-down horse. When you're a child and you look up, things feel a little bit distorted, yeah. And the horse, of course, didn't know the way. So, as I mentioned, I've got a very large family with very many experiences. And you will find that some of these writings are from their stories. So that's essentially the evolution of how this series came together, my perspective that I bring to it. My experience as an artist is always evolving too. I started on the farm doing calligraphy for the church, as we talked about before, because I didn't have to do the chores while I was doing it. I ended up making my living as a calligrapher for some 20 years, designing note cards, selling calligraphic artwork for organizations and individuals. And then I went through what, I don't know, many women might go through at about my 50s, maybe men do too, a sort of a health crisis, life crisis. Oh my God, I'm not 20 years old anymore. And I began to feel like, it's this change of what's important to me. And I needed to retune up myself, see the world suddenly differently. And I started with this painting, looking back when I was 12 and my oldest sister got married. And I suddenly began to realize if I can bring these memories back into my head, I can also grab some of that optimism and joy of life that we bring to our childhood so often. And I began to bring that whole perspective to many of my experiences of the time. If I can make a painting of it, I can find the joy in it. And it helped me get through this dark period in my life and bring back the joy. I hope you find that when you look at my paintings, some of that joy. So I like the idea of a U.S. poet laureate said something about paintings can tune you up when you're feeling out of tune, and that's part of the reason I create. I want to play now with a little experience with you. I mentioned the maps that you can create of places you've been to in the past. And now my reading and research about memory kind of also encouraged me to experience it by adding the other senses. So when you have that visual map, here's my kindergarten room, and here's where the finger painting was. But what did it smell like? So to bring in these other senses, can you imagine the smell of the kindergarten room and the little dirty hands and the little, maybe some pants that didn't make it to the bathroom in time? The smells of kindergarten, and then the sounds that were incorporated in that, the piano that the teacher was playing, or the little whimpering of your fellow 5-year-olds who were away from home for the first time, all the sounds. And then to think about the feeling of things around you, maybe the humidity in the air or the sticky milk that's on the table. And if we bring in all our senses, we can bring back some of those memories from our past. So I like that idea of incorporating all your senses and reflecting on the entire experience, and then maybe starting to look back at old photographs and look for all those details that you didn't quite bring up. So here's the method of how I paint. I use gouache. Have you ever heard of gouache? Oh, good. It's a form of watercolor. It's opaque. It allows you to overpaint. Watercolor tends to be transparent. Gouache tends to have larger particles you can paint on the top. It's a little bit like painting with a water-based oil, but not as difficult. Yeah, you've been there. So I encourage you to incorporate your own memories into the things you create. Are any of you artists? Quilt makers, seamstresses, drawers, fiber artists? If we can, or even collage makers with experiences of a day, putting together the ticket with jot notes and the postcard. It's wonderful to grab our memories, create things with them, and share those memories. It's often a point of the beginning of communication. So I didn't give you much space to put your 2 cents in here because my presentation is so much about the personal, but it is also a presentation, the art is a presentation of farming from about the 1940s to about the 1970s. It's changed, hasn't it?
Yes and no. So the background here is just like was said in the introduction. I moved to Iowa from San Francisco area. I had been born and raised in the New York area, lived in Utah in between those two places. But I had never lived on a farm. I had never lived in a rural community. I was, however, a food and agriculture journalist for those 20, 25 years before I moved. So I thought I knew what was going on, which is part of the book, is just the fact that once we arrived, or right before when we started doing a business plan and spreadsheets, and kind of realized that I knew nothing about the economics of agriculture, even though I had reported on it for so long. So, I mean, I would say that, you know, the reflecting on this work, it's so interesting because the book is very much sort of the same, where it's my husband's father's stories throughout the book. And those moments in time that he told us about, and then could kind of reflect upon how did that impact agriculture today? You know, what is the difference between when he was doing what he was doing and what we're doing now? He raised corn and beans and cattle. We stopped raising corn and beans, and we raise grass-finished beef now and goats. We raise vegetables. We have a brand new building that has farm stays and activities in it, teaching classes. So, I mean, those things are very different, but at the same time, the economics of agriculture is very, very similar in many ways as to when he was telling his stories about boom and bust experiences, about everybody getting on the bandwagon of hogs and then the world of hogs dropping out from under everybody. You know, arguably we have entered another kind of farm crisis where people are losing farms at large numbers. So the things that he talked about were similar and really helped to kind of bridge that time, you know, that the more things change, the more things stay the same in a sense. But I love that idea of, you know, in my book, what I tried to do with what I teach about memoir is like we can use our experiences, our very specific experiences, and being very vulnerable about those experiences to open up those like communal, very connective things about love, about family, about economics, financial hard times. So each of these kind of vignettes is very similar in a way to how I wrote about, when you see like the perspectives of being certain things are highlighted, certain things are, in the background. And it's all kind of about what you feel is important or should like be the point of the story. But at the same time, like not leaving out the details. And I think that's a really interesting part about your work. The feeling like things are upside down, often on a farm, that's the same in the 40s as it was in the 60s as it was in the 2000s.
One of the points I read in your book was that idea that farms need to get bigger or die. And you discussed that much better than I ever could. But I have to say that my brothers, who do continue to farm on the farm I grew up on, I have had that experience. And it went from when I was a child milking 30 to 40 cows with 4 milking machines and 7 kids or 10 kids or whoever was at home at the time, to now having 200 milk cows, a milking parlor, 800 acres under farm tilling, and 4 adult men farming this entire operation. It's amazing. They're working 3 a.m. till 7 p.m. daily.
Yeah, and you think about, we've had this perception in agriculture that as like you got to get bigger, but where is that line really where you're like big enough, where you've gotten there, and now we're here, and we're financially stable, and everything's good. There is no line. And those families, I met a young woman who was taking over a ginormous farm in South Dakota, and she said, we are those families who receive huge government payments, and those payments are back out the door the next day. Like, we constantly have a cash flow problem. We've never arrived where it's like, and now here are the profits. It's just it's always going back into the farm apparatus.
Yeah.
So,
and there's no doorway of retirement. My 2 brothers who farm are in their 60s. Mm-hmm. And as I was telling you earlier, one just had a lung transplant this year. Farming is a dangerous job. Retirement, he should be retiring. He shouldn't be milking cows. Mm-hmm. His doctors say, you shouldn't be in that barn.
Yeah.
But there's no option to, how do you retire? How do you leave this huge operation? You can't just donate it to the next generation. Right.
People have to sell to the next generation, and when you are land rich, cash poor, which most farms are, that's the whole idea of it. Is we've stockpiled land and often machinery that we can then offload to fund the retirement. But then who is that generation who can afford to pay those high prices to let you retire? Is it, we all sell to Bill Gates, or, where can we pass it on to the next generation, or have farmers without lots of access to land get into the game? It's a difficult part.
Very different game than it was 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Very different. And this is a perfect segue to Roberta's presentation. It is almost 1:30, so maybe a little 10-minute break, and then Roberta, because I think she will discuss more of the economics, and I'll leave it to you to explain the rest.